The valley held its breath that morning. Dew clung to the wheat grass. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney of a ranch house carved straight from the bones of the land. Inside, a man built of silence and splinters stood at his window, watching a young woman limp across his kitchen floor. Silas Ward wasn't known for drama. Folks in Cedar Falls called him the quiet rancher. Built like the barns, he hammered together solid, weathered, unshakable. 15 years he'd lived alone on this spread, speaking only when words were worth more than the silence they replaced. But this morning, the silence betrayed him. It made room for something he couldn't ignore. Mercy Whitmore had arrived 3 months prior with the whisper of a past and eyes too old for her age. She worked hard, didn't gossip, didn't flinch when chores were rough. Silas liked that. He'd hired her on instinct, the same way he trusted the sky to tell him if rain was coming. But now, her movements were wrong. Through the streaked window pane, Silas saw her drag 1 foot behind her, like it was tethered to sorrow. She reached for the countertop, slowly, like the floor might reach up and slap her. Her face pinched with pain she thought no one saw, but Silas saw. He stepped inside. The air smelled of burned coffee and secrets. Mercy straightened at the sound of his boots, stirring a pot like it might cast a spell to erase her injuries. "Morning, Mr. Ward," she said lightly, too lightly. Her voice floated like smoke above a fire she didn't want to name. He watched her wipe the same spot on the counter 3 times. He watched the tremor in her hand. He watched her flinch when he took the coffee cup from her fingers, cold in a warm kitchen. "Mercy," he said gently. She froze. "You're hurt?" Not a question. A truth, laid bare like a wound too long ignored. She turned slowly. Her lip was split. A bruise bloomed across her cheek. "I fell," she said too fast. "Just clumsy." Silas nodded slowly. "Show me where." Her eyes flickered. The lie unraveled. There were no stairs to fall from in her cabin. Just 1 step up, and he'd built it himself. She knew she'd been caught. And Silas Ward knew this wasn't just a fall. It was a message written on her skin by someone who thought no one would ever read it, and now the wrong man had read it. Silas didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring up at the rafters he'd hoisted himself 15 years ago, listening to the creak of wood cooling in the dark. Outside, coyotes sang in the hills, but inside that cabin something else howled, something older, colder, a realization, a decision forming like frost on the windows. By dawn it had hardened. He found Mercy in the kitchen again. Her limp was worse now, the silence between them heavier. She didn't look at him when she poured his coffee, and her hair was pulled forward, too far forward, covering bruises like they were secrets. "Mercy," he said, voice steady, "I need you to tell me the truth." The pot trembled in her hand. "Briggs has been coming around, hasn't he?" She went still. For a second he thought she might drop the coffee pot. When she set it down, her fingers stayed curled around the handle like it anchored her to this world. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. "I saw him yesterday at your door. I saw how you looked after he left." Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry, not yet. "You don't understand," she finally said. "He's the law. No one listens to girls like me over men like him." And then the flood came. She told him about the first time, about how Briggs had cornered her behind the general store, about threats dressed as promises, about how he whispered things only a monster would say, and how he never had to raise his voice because the fear he sowed did all the screaming for him. She told him how he made sure no one else would hire her, how he told the town she was under his protection, how he'd made it clear her body was his property, and how if she spoke up, he'd make sure no one ever found her bones in the mountains. Silas listened without blinking. Every word she spoke added another stone to the cold fury rising in his gut. "You could have left," he said softly. She laughed. Bitter. Empty. "To where? With what money? He made sure of that. You were the only one who'd give me work. You—" Her voice cracked. "You were the only person who saw me like a human being." Silas stood up, slowly, like something immense had just risen inside him. "He's not going to hurt you again." "You don't understand," she said. "He'll kill you. He'll lie. He'll get the sheriff to arrest you for breathing wrong. Men like him, they protect each other." But Silas was already moving. At the door he paused. "There's something you ought to know about me, Mercy. I may not say much, but I've never once let a snake sleep in my yard and lived to regret it." He stepped into the morning light, boots crunching frost off the porch. Behind him, Mercy stared, caught between fear and a sliver of something else. Hope. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where people didn't speak until they were sure no one was listening. But when Silas Ward walked down its main street that morning, heads turned, conversations hushed. Because when a man like Silas came to town, something serious had followed him in. He didn't head for the sheriff's office. He didn't go to the store or the post. He went to the saloon, and there he found exactly what he expected: Deputy Vernon Briggs, leaning against a post like it was his personal throne, badge gleaming in the sun, grin wide with stories of someone else's misfortune. Silas stopped 10 feet away, just close enough to cast a long shadow. Briggs squinted at him, eyes narrowing like a dog sensing another predator. "Well, if it ain't the mute rancher," Briggs called out. "What brings you down from your little kingdom? Come to buy some manners?" "I came to talk," Silas said. Briggs laughed, spitting into the dirt. "That right? About what?" "About Mercy Whitmore." The grin died. The silence that followed cracked the morning open like thunder. Even the horses at the hitching posts seemed to shift, uneasy. The townsfolk watched from windows, behind barrels, pretending not to. "I don't know who that is," Briggs said flatly. Silas took one step forward. "You know her." Briggs's hand dropped near his belt, fingers grazing the butt of his pistol. "You accusing me of something, Ward?" "I'm stating a fact," Silas said. "You've been hurting a woman who works under my roof. A woman you think can't fight back." That was when Briggs smiled again, but colder this time. "You better have proof." Silas reached into his vest and pulled a folded piece of paper. Blank. Just something to stir the water. "I got what I need." The way Briggs stared at it, nervous, calculating, that told Silas more than any confession. "You're bluffing," Briggs snapped, but his voice had lost its footing. "You draw," Silas said, "and I'll make sure the whole town sees what kind of man you really are." Briggs's eyes flicked left-right, measuring, weighing risk, and then he moved. Fast, but not fast enough. The gun came up. Silas was already moving sideways, just like he practiced in his mind all night. The shot cracked like dry lightning, splintering the post where Silas had stood. Screams echoed. Townsfolk scattered. But Silas closed the distance, shoulder first, slamming into Briggs with the force of a mountain storm. They crashed against the saloon wall. Wood creaked. A window cracked. Briggs cursed, swinging wildly. But Silas was a rancher. His hands didn't flinch from pain. They knew how to break a horse's wildness and a man's bravado. The gun fell, sliding across the boards, landing at the boots of a man whose presence silenced even chaos. Marshal Kane, gun drawn, voice calm, but iron-wrapped. "That's enough." Briggs clutched his wrist, lip bleeding, eyes wild. "He attacked me! Arrest him!" But Kane didn't move. He was watching the crowd, watching how they lingered now, no longer afraid, watching how one by one they stepped forward. Mrs. Henderson, white hair pinned tight, voice shaking. "Marshal, There are things you need to know. She's right, came another voice. It was Jonas, the blacksmith, wiping soot on his apron, stepping forward with steel in his eyes. Briggs came around my shop last winter asking questions about my daughter. When she turned him down, she found dead mice nailed to our door. A merchant added his voice next, hands trembling. He searched my store 3 times in 1 week, claimed he was looking for stolen goods. Funny how he always left with something in his pocket. The crowd grew, like a dam giving way. One by one, stories spilled, threats, intimidation, missing money, bruises hidden under collars, all pointing to the same man, the same badge. Briggs stood frozen, eyes wide as the noose of truth tightened. Marshal Kane listened to it all, his jaw clenched tighter with each word. Finally, he turned to Silas. "You said you had proof?" Silas nodded, and this time pulled something real. From his pocket, he produced a torn piece of cloth, faded blue, torn jagged. "I found this near Mercy's cabin this morning," he said. "Matches the sleeve on the shirt he's wearing now." Briggs looked down and paled. Kane took the fabric, held it against Briggs's sleeve. It was a perfect match. "You lying bastard," Briggs snarled, lunging forward. Kane's revolver rose without hesitation. "That's enough." The marshal's voice hit like cold water on hot iron. "Vernon Briggs," he said, "you're under arrest for abuse of authority, assault, and conspiracy to silence a witness," the deputy sputtered. "You can't—" "I just did." Kane clicked the irons on himself. The town watched, some in awe, some in silent, tearful relief. The shackles of fear broken. As Kane led Briggs toward the jailhouse, Silas stood tall in the middle of the street. Dust swirled around his boots. His silence had spoken louder than any sermon. A man of few words, finally speaking, and the world listened. The door to the jail slammed shut behind Vernon Briggs, and for the first time in years, Cedar Falls felt like it could exhale. Marshal Kane hung the key on a nail just behind his desk, visible, symbolic, final. "You'll need to bring Miss Whitmore in tomorrow," he told Silas, "for a statement, official and on the record." Silas gave a quiet nod. "She'll come, if she's ready." Kane's face darkened. "I should have seen it. Should have stopped him long ago." "We all should have," Silas replied, then paused. "But it ends now." He mounted his horse and rode slow, letting the weight of the morning settle. The wind felt different, less like something biting, more like something cleansing. His land came into view just as the sun broke the clouds, laying gold over every fence post and field. Mercy was sitting on the porch of her cabin, not moving, just watching the horizon. She didn't rise when she saw him, didn't speak, but her eyes, those hollow, frightened eyes, searched his face as he approached, searching for what she'd stopped hoping to find. "Safety. It's done," Silas said. "He's in jail. He won't touch you again." Her knees buckled as if her body had held out just long enough to hear those words. She dropped to the steps, head in her hands, no longer hiding the tears, not holding them in. She sobbed not with the sharp cries of panic, but the trembling, unfamiliar rhythm of release. Silas knelt beside her, didn't speak, just stayed. Let her cry, let her be. When the sun dipped lower, Mercy finally looked up. Her eyes were red but steadier. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't owe me thanks," Silas said. "You owe yourself healing." And then, as if catching a breath she'd forgotten she was allowed to take, Mercy smiled. It was small, fragile, but it was the first time he'd seen her smile since the day she arrived. That evening, a quiet peace blanketed the ranch like snowfall without cold. The animals stirred less. The trees didn't creak. Even the wind moved slower, as if it too wanted to tread softly around what had just happened. Inside the main house, Silas sat with a journal he hadn't opened in years, not to write, but to remember. His father had taught him that when a man carried someone else's burden, he'd better have strong legs and a steady heart. Silas hadn't realized until today how long Mercy had been carrying hers alone. He walked back out under the stars just as Mercy stepped down from her porch, a blanket around her shoulders. "You sure he won't come back?" she asked. "I made sure," Silas said. And Marshall Kane's not the kind to turn a blind eye again. She stood there, hugging herself tightly. "I was afraid," she said, "for so long. Not just of him, but of what people would say, of how they'd look at me. I thought if I stayed quiet, maybe it would all pass." Silas nodded slowly. "But monsters don't vanish when you close your eyes." She looked up at him. "And if you hadn't spoken up," he didn't let her finish. "You did the hard part, Mercy," he said. "You survived. All I did was open a door you'd already been banging on in silence." A shooting star tore across the sky above them, trailing light behind the dark. It wasn't over yet, not entirely. There'd be questions, official hearings, papers to sign, folks in town who'd whisper and judge. But something had cracked open, something irreversible. Mercy wasn't the same girl who scrubbed his kitchen counters in silence. And Silas, he wasn't just the quiet rancher anymore. He was something else now. Something louder than any badge. The next morning, Mercy rode into town beside Silas. It was the first time she'd left the ranch since arriving months ago. Her hands gripped the reins tight, but her posture had changed. No longer hunched. No longer folded in on herself. There was steel now tempered in fear, but forged in truth. When they entered Cedar Falls, eyes followed them. Some curious, some skeptical, but none hostile. The news had already spread. It always did, especially when justice caught up to someone wearing a badge. At the jailhouse, Marshall Kane waited outside. He greeted Mercy with a nod of quiet respect, then opened the door. Briggs was there, still in his cell, unshaven, pale. His eyes flicked up when he saw Mercy, then dropped. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She stepped forward. Silas watched from behind, saying nothing, letting her take the space. She stood just outside the bars, looking through them like one might examine a caged animal at a traveling fair. "I used to believe you'd win," she said quietly. "That men like you always did." Briggs didn't respond. "You taught me fear," she continued. "But Mr. Ward taught me something stronger." Briggs shifted, as if the air had thickened. Mercy took a step back. "You'll rot in that cell, and the worst part? No one's coming to save you." Kane closed the logbook with a firm thud. "That's all we need," he said. As they walked out into the noon sun, Mercy turned to Silas. "I'm not sure what happens next." Silas looked at her. "You get to decide now. That's the difference." The days that followed felt unfamiliar. Not because anything looked different, but because everything felt different. Like a storm had passed in the night and scrubbed the air clean. Mercy moved around the ranch with more ease, her limp easing slowly. She wore her hair tied back now, no longer using it to hide the bruises that were fading from her skin, and even faster from her spirit. Silas noticed the small things. She lingered longer on the porch in the evenings. She laughed once, quiet, unsure, like she'd forgotten how. She even joined him at the table one evening, just for supper. Not as a servant, not as an obligation, but as someone beginning to believe she belonged. "I've been thinking," Mercy said softly as she passed the potatoes. Silas looked up. "I might stay on," she continued. "At least for a while." He didn't smile, not exactly, but the corners of his eyes softened, and that was all the answer she needed. The next day the town came calling. Marshall Kane arrived first, but not alone. Behind him came a woman from the district court, papers in hand, her demeanor clipped and polite. They asked Mercy for her statement, this time officially, this time with protection guaranteed. Mercy didn't hesitate. She told the truth again, but this time in the open. When she finished, the woman from the court looked at her with something like awe. "You'll never know how many women this might help," she said quietly. Mercy blinked at that. She hadn't thought of it that way. She hadn't thought beyond her own pain. But now, hearing it spoken aloud, she realized the truth. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. That evening, after the court officers left, Mercy walked out to the north pasture where Silas was mending a fence. The sky behind her was pink and bleeding into gold, and the mountains looked softer, like they were listening. "I've been thinking," she said again. Silas drove the last nail in, then looked at her. "About what?" "I used to dream of escape," she said. "Now I dream of rebuilding." She let her fingers graze the top rail of the fence, the wood warm from the sun. "I'd like to learn more. About the ranch. About cattle. About how things grow." Silas studied her face, not the bruises, not the damage, but the resolve forming underneath it all. "You want to stay on full time?" he asked. "I want to be more than a maid," she said. Silas nodded. "Then you will be. No ceremony, no big speeches, just two people, under a dying sun, agreeing on a future that neither thought possible months ago." And in the weeks that followed, Mercy proved she wasn't just surviving, she was becoming something new. She helped Silas tag calves, learned the names of each horse, repaired the tool shed roof when a storm took it off one night, but more than that, she became known. In town, people began to greet her by name. They spoke less in hushed tones. Children waved. Even Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house brought over a jar of preserves one Sunday and left it at her cabin door. The town was changing, and it started with one truth spoken out loud. One morning, weeks after Briggs had been transferred to the county prison, Mercy brought Silas a letter. "It's from the court," she said. "They're offering to relocate me if I want. New start. Different town." Silas read the letter in silence, then handed it back. "What do you want?" he asked. Mercy folded the page carefully, her fingers no longer trembling like they once had. "For the first time in my life," she said, "I'm not running. I want to build something that lasts." She looked around the ranch, the wide fields, the crooked porch swing, the barn leaning slightly westward like an old man who'd seen too much. "This place saved me." "No," Silas said, "you saved yourself. This place just gave you the room." A hawk screeched overhead, circling wide above the valley. Below it, Mercy smiled. "I'd like to teach other girls what I've learned," she said. "Maybe start a schoolhouse or a reading circle. Something small. Something good." Silas nodded. "Then we'll build it." And that was how it began. Not with vengeance, not with violence, but with wood and nails and two people who'd survived the worst of men and refused to let that be the end of their story. By the time winter came, there was a new structure beside Mercy's cabin, one room, bright windows. A sign hung above the door, carved by Silas's own hand. "The Whitmore House, for girls who need a start." And in the evenings, you could sometimes hear laughter spilling out into the snow-covered fields. The ranch was no longer silent, and neither was she. Out in the West, they say justice rides a slow horse, that it doesn't always wear a badge, or carry a rifle, or speak in sermons. Sometimes it lives quietly on a ranch built with bare hands and silence. Sometimes it wears calloused palms and a stare that sees straight through a lie. Silas Ward never asked to be a hero. He didn't carry the righteousness of preachers or the loud defiance of rebels. He wasn't a man of big speeches or public crusades. But when the moment came, when one young woman limped through his kitchen pretending she wasn't in pain, he stood up. And because he did, the town stood too. That's the thing about courage. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the voice that breaks a long silence, the moment someone finally says, enough. Mercy Whitmore's story wasn't unique, not in that time, not in ours. But what made it powerful was that it didn't end in fear. It ended in flame, in rebuilding. In a schoolhouse beside a ranch where truth was planted and grew into something good, people remembered what happened in Cedar Falls. They told their daughters, they taught their sons. They whispered in church pews and over fence rails that no man, no matter his badge or title, had the right to steal dignity and walk away. And sometimes, when the wind swept across the valley just right, folks said you could hear laughter coming from that one-room schoolhouse, the kind of laughter that only exists in places where shadows used to live, places where someone decided the past wouldn't be the future, where silence ended and justice began.